Mountain Man cuts a dog free from barbed wire. What the dog did next shocked him. Snow crunches under heavy boots. A rugged mountain man kneels in the freezing wind, his knife sawing through cruel strands of barbed wire. A half-starved dog lies trapped, whimpering in pain. With one last cut, the animal is free. But that's only the beginning. Hours later, the dog returns, not alone. At its side is a frightened child, running from a cattleman who claims to own her. The church. Bell tolls. Hooves thunder down the frozen trail. A cabin door slams against the storm as danger rides closer. This wasn't just an act of mercy. It's a fight for a child's life, for land, for justice itself. The dog has chosen its master, but in doing so, it has set fire to a battle that could consume them all. Will one lonely mountain man be strong enough to protect them both? Or will barbed wire and greed tear apart the only family he has left? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Winter wind whistled through the gaps in Paul Turner's cabin logs as he stood in his chopping block, methodically splitting wood for his evening fire. His weathered hands gripped the axe handle with practiced ease, each stroke precise despite the cold numbing his fingers. 58 winters in these mountains had taught him the rhythm of survival. Work, rest, repeat. The morning sky hung low and gray, promising more snow. Paul's breath clouded in front of his face as he paused between swings, rolling his tired shoulders. The solitude suited him just fine. Out here, a man could go weeks without having to put on a pleasant face for anybody. Just him, the mountains, and the quiet. Until it wasn't quiet anymore. The first yelp was so faint, he almost missed it. Paul lowered his axe, head cocked to one side. There it came again, a desperate, pained sound carrying on the wind. He frowned, considering whether to investigate. Getting involved usually meant trouble, and trouble was exactly what he'd come up here to avoid. The third cry decided it for him. Grumbling under his breath, Paul propped his axe against the chopping block and pulled his coat tighter. He followed the sound across the snow-covered ground, boots crunching with each step. The yelping grew louder as he approached the meadow, where Miller's new fence cut across the landscape like an ugly scar. That's where he found the dog, thoroughly tangled in the barbed wire. The shepherd's gray and white coat was matted with blood, where the cruel barbs had torn into flesh. Its muzzle was scratched raw, likely from trying to free itself. The animal's eyes were wide with fear and pain as it struggled weakly against its metal prison. Paul approached slowly, speaking in low, steady tones. "Easy there, fella. I ain't gonna hurt you none." He knelt in the snow, ignoring the cold seeping through his pants as he assessed the situation. The dog was well and truly caught, wrapped in at least 6 strands of the wire. Reaching for his hunting knife, Paul kept up his quiet monologue. "Gonna get you loose here, but you've got to hold still." The dog's eyes followed his every move. When the blade came out, the animal snapped at the air, more fear than fight in the gesture. I know, Paul murmured. "Ain't pleasant being stuck like this, but we'll have you free soon enough." One by one, Paul cut through the strands of wire. His fingers grew numb as he worked, carefully keeping the sharp edges away from both himself and the dog. The shepherd remained tense, but stopped struggling, as if understanding help had arrived. When the last wire fell away, Paul expected the dog to bolt. Instead, it just lay there in the bloodied snow, sides heaving as it caught its breath. Those intelligent eyes stayed fixed on Paul's face, studying him with an intensity that made him somewhat uncomfortable. There was something knowing in that gaze, something that went beyond simple animal awareness. "Can you walk?" Paul asked, feeling foolish for talking to a dog. The animal made no move to rise. Sighing, Paul shrugged out of his coat and carefully wrapped it around the injured shepherd. "Reckon you ain't giving me much choice here." With gentle hands, he lifted the dog, surprised at how light it felt beneath. Its thick fur must have been on its own for some time by the feel of those ribs. The walk back to his cabin seemed longer with his burden. By the time Paul pushed through his door, his arms were aching and his shirt was soaked with melted snow. He laid the dog near the banked fire, adding fresh logs to build up the warmth. "Stay put," he instructed, though the animal showed no inclination to move. Paul gathered what supplies he had: clean rags, the bottle of whiskey he saved for medicinal purposes, and a bowl of water. The dog watched him work, barely flinching as Paul cleaned each wound with whiskey-soaked cloth and wrapped the worst gashes in strips of worn flannel. When he'd done what he could, Paul sat back on his heels, studying his unexpected guest. "That's about all I can manage," he told the dog. "Rest is up to you." The shepherd's tail thumped once against the floor. Acknowledgement or thanks, Paul couldn't say. As darkness gathered outside his windows, Paul found himself with more company than he'd had in months. He told himself it was temporary, just until the animal healed enough to move on. No sense getting attached, but watching the dog drift into exhausted sleep by his fire, Paul couldn't shake the feeling that his solitary life had just taken an unexpected turn. Dawn crept over the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and gold. Paul stirred the cabin's banked coals, adding fresh kindling as he cast a glance at his four-legged guest. The shepherd dog lay near the hearth, wounds cleaned and bandaged, watching Paul's every move with those knowing eyes. "Reckon you'll be wanting to head out soon," Paul muttered, more to himself than the animal. He'd seen plenty of wild creatures come and go over the years, accepting help when needed before disappearing back into the wilderness where they belonged. After a simple breakfast of cornbread and coffee, Paul opened his cabin door to let in the crisp morning air. The dog rose carefully, favoring its injured leg, and limped to the threshold. It paused there, looking back at Paul with an expression that almost seemed grateful, before hobbling down the steps and into the forest. Paul watched until the animal vanished among the trees. "Well, that's that," he said, turning back to his daily chores. The morning passed quietly as he repaired a loose shutter, cleaned his rifle, and organized his modest pantry. By afternoon, the temperature had risen enough to make wood-splitting bearable. The steady thunk of his axe echoed through the clearing as Paul settled into his work. He just paused to wipe sweat from his brow when movement at the forest's edge caught his eye. The shepherd dog had returned, but something was different. Paul squinted, then slowly lowered his axe as he made out a small figure clinging to the dog's thick neck fur. A child emerged from the shadows of the pines, half hidden behind the shepherd's broad frame. She was rail-thin, dressed in a tattered dress with worn moccasins on her feet. Her dark eyes watched Paul with a mixture of fear and desperation. Paul judged her to be no more than 9 years old, her native features marking her as Navajo. Paul stood frozen, uncertain how to proceed. He'd spent so many years avoiding human contact that he barely remembered how to manage it, let alone with a frightened child. The dog seemed to sense his hesitation, giving a soft whine and nudging the girl gently forward. "You hungry?" Paul finally asked, keeping his voice low and gentle. The girl didn't respond, but her eyes darted to the cabin's open door. "Got some stew warming on the stove. Bread too, if you've a mind for it." The mention of food drew her forward a few hesitant steps, though she kept one hand buried in the shepherd's fur. Paul moved slowly toward his cabin, making his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He was acutely aware of how his tall frame must appear to such a small child. Inside, Paul ladled thick venison stew into a bowl and cut several slices of day-old bread. He set these on his rough-hewn table, then backed away to give the girl space. She crept in after him, the dog at her side, and perched on the edge of a chair like a sparrow ready to take flight at the slightest movement. "Got a name?" Paul asked as she began to eat, trying to maintain some dignity despite her obvious hunger. "Lily," she whispered between careful bites. "Lily Yazzie. I'm Paul Turner." He settled into his own chair, keeping the table between them. "That dog bring you here?" Lily nodded, glancing down at her four-legged protector. "He find me. After I run." "Run from where?" Her thin shoulders hunched. "Mr. Cray Ranch. He take me after fever, take parents. Say I his property now." The words came out halting her. English broken, but clear enough to make Paul's jaw clench with anger. "Jed Cray?" Paul knew of the cattleman by reputation, none of it good. The girl nodded again, shrinking further into herself. Paul ran a weathered hand over his face, suddenly feeling every one of his 58 years. He had no business getting involved in this situation. He'd left the complications of the world behind for good reason. But looking at the trust the shepherd dog placed in him, and the desperate hope hidden behind Lily's wary expression, he couldn't bring himself to turn them away. Not tonight, at least. "You can bed down here for the night," he said gruffly. "Got some blankets you can use." Later, after arranging a pallet near the hearth, Paul watched as Lily curled up beside the shepherd dog. The animal curved protectively around her small form, both of them dropping quickly into exhausted sleep. Paul retired to his own narrow bed, but rest eluded him. He lay awake long into the night, listening to the wind whistle through the canyon and wondering what twist of fate had led these two lost souls to his door. The simple life he'd carved out for himself suddenly felt less certain, as if the world he'd tried so hard to leave behind had found its way back to him, bringing with it all the complications he'd hoped to avoid. Morning light streamed through the cabin's frosted windows, harsh and bright against the fresh snow. Paul stood at his cast-iron stove, stirring a pot of cornmeal mush while bacon sizzled in a well-worn skillet. The familiar scents filled the small space, mixing with wood smoke from the hearth, where Lily still huddled close to the shepherd dog. "Breakfast's ready," Paul announced, keeping his voice gentle. He'd noticed how she startled at sudden sounds, like a wild creature ready to bolt. He spooned generous portions onto 2 tin plates, adding strips of crispy bacon alongside the steaming mush. Lily approached the table cautiously, the dog padding silently beside her. She ate with the desperate speed of someone used to having food snatched away, though her movements remained precise, careful not to spill a single morsel. Her dark eyes never stopped moving, darting between Paul, the door, and back to her guardian dog. Paul pretended not to notice her vigilance, focusing instead on his own meal while his mind churned over what to do next. The morning passed quietly as he went about his usual tasks, feeding chickens, checking his trap lines, gathering more firewood. Lily stayed close to the cabin, watching him work while whispering softly to the shepherd in her native tongue. Just past midday, sharp knocking shattered the peaceful scene. The sound echoed like gunshots through the cabin, causing Lily to shrink behind the dog, whose hackles rose as a low growl rumbled in his chest. Paul opened the door to find Jed Cray's broad frame filling the entrance, flanked by 2 ranch hands with rifles slung across their backs. The cattleman's expensive coat and polished boots stood in stark contrast to Paul's warm buckskins. "Turner," Cray said, his voice carrying the false warmth of a snake oil salesman. "Word is you're harboring my ward." His pale eyes slid past Paul, searching the cabin's interior. Paul shifted to block his view. "Wasn't aware you had one." The Yazzie girl. Cray's smile tightened. "Her folks passed from fever last spring. As a Christian man, I took her in, gave her honest work and a proper roof." He'd pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Got the documents right here, signed by the Indian agent himself. She's lawfully under." My protection. Paul's jaw clenched as he recalled Lily's terror, the telling bruises circling her thin wrists. Seems to me a ward ain't the same as property. Now see here, Cray's friendly facade cracked slightly. That girl's my responsibility. I won't have some mountain hermit interfering with my legal rights. He took a step forward, boots crunching in the snow. Hand her over, Turner. Don't make this complicated. Behind Paul, the shepherd's growl grew louder. Lily pressed herself against the cabin's back wall, eyes wide with fear. Reckon we'll let the marshal or preacher sort this out proper, Paul said firmly. Till then, she stays here where she feels safe. Color rose in Cray's cheeks. You're making a mistake, old man. I've got the law on my side. Maybe so, Paul replied evenly. But she ain't leaving unless she wants to. That's my final word on it. The two men locked eyes for a long moment before Cray stepped back, adjusting his coat with deliberate care. Have it your way for now, Turner. But this ain't over. He turned sharply, gesturing to his men. Let's ride. Paul watched them mount up and ride away, their horses' hooves leaving deep prints in the pristine snow. Only when they disappeared. Around the bend did he close the door, his hand shaking slightly as he slid the bar into place. The cabin remained silent until after sunset, when Paul had built up the fire and served a simple supper of beans and salt pork. Lily sat close to the flames, the dog's head resting in her lap as she stroked his ears. He hurt you? Paul asked quietly. Cray? Lily's fingers tightened in the dog's fur. Made me work all day. No rest. No food if work not good enough. Her voice dropped to a whisper, hit with belt when angry. Say I slave now, not person no more. Paul's heart ached at her words. He'd spent years avoiding the cruelties of men, hiding in these mountains where only nature's hardships held sway. But now fate had dropped this child in his path, and he couldn't turn away. Listen here, Lily, he said, meeting her dark eyes. Across the fire. Long as you want to stay, this cabin's your home. Won't let him take you back against your will. You have my word on that. Lily nodded solemnly, some of the tension easing from her small frame. As the fire burned lower, casting dancing shadows on the log walls, Paul realized he had crossed a line there was no stepping back from. He had set himself against Jed Cray and all the man's influence in the territory. The thought should have terrified him, but instead he felt a curious peace. For the first time in years, he was sure of his path. Dawn painted the Colorado sky in pale strokes of pink and gold as Paul Turner hitched his own mule to the wooden sled. The morning air bit sharp and cold, his breath forming clouds in the frigid. Mountain air. Lily stood quietly nearby, wrapped in Paul's thickest buffalo robe, with the shepherd dog pressed against her legs for warmth. 12 miles to town, Paul said, adjusting the harness straps. Trail's packed down, but it'll still be slow going. The mule snorted and stamped its hooves in the crusty snow as they set out. Paul walked alongside, leading the animal with practiced patience while Lily huddled on the sled, the dog's watchful presence never leaving her side. The runners creaked against the snow, and the mule's steady breathing marked time with their progress down the mountain trail dot as morning stretched toward. Noon, Lily began humming softly. The melody floated on the winter air, a Navajo lullaby that seemed to speak of distant mesas and summer winds. Paul glanced back at her, struck by how the simple song carried such weight of memory. The shepherd dog rested his head on her lap, eyes half closed in contentment. The sun had passed its peak when they finally caught sight of Silver Bluff, the small town spread out below them, a collection of weather-worn buildings nestled in the valley. Smoke rose straight and thin from a dozen chimneys into the clear afternoon sky. As they made their way down the main street, townsfolk paused in their tasks, turning to stare at the peculiar sight of the reclusive mountain man, the Navajo child, and the scarred shepherd dog, thought Paul, guided them toward the white-clapboard church that stood at the end of the street, its simple cross reaching toward heaven. Before they reached the steps, the door swung open to reveal Reverend Thomas Parker, his silver hair catching the winter light. "Paul Turner," the preacher said warmly, though his eyes held questions. "It's been many months since we've seen you in town." "Reverend," Paul nodded, helping Lily down from the sled. "Got a situation needs your counsel." Martha Parker appeared in the doorway behind her husband, her kind face creasing with concern as she took in Lily's thin frame and worn clothing. Come in," she urged. "There's a fire in the parlor, and I've just made fresh coffee." Inside the parsonage, warm lamplight cast a gentle glow over simple furnishings. Mrs. Parker settled, Lily near the pot-bellied stove with a cup of hot tea, while Paul explained the situation to the Reverend. The shepherd dog stationed himself at Lily's feet, accepting a gentle pat from Mrs. Parker. "Jed Cray's influence runs deep here," Reverend Parker said gravely when Paul finished speaking. "He's got the sheriff's ear, and the Indian agent takes his word as gospel." The preacher stroked his chin thoughtfully. "We'll need to tread carefully, Brother Paul, very carefully indeed." Mrs. Parker had been listening intently while warming more tea. Now she disappeared into another room, returning moments later with a small leather-bound Bible. "Every child should have their own scripture," she said, sitting beside Lily. Opening the cover, she showed where she had carefully inscribed Lily Yazzie in flowing script on the flyleaf. "This is yours now, dear one." Lily traced the letters of her name with wondering fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the book to her chest. "She can stay here tonight," Mrs. Parker announced, her tone brooking no argument. "We'll make up the spare room, and I'll see about finding her some proper winter clothes." Reverend Parker nodded agreement. "It's safer than having her back at your cabin, Paul, at least until we can sort this out properly." "Much obliged, Paul." Sod, his gruff voice softening as he watched Lily lean trustingly against Mrs. Parker's side. "I aim to ride out tomorrow, see if I can find any proof of her father's land rights. Might be something that'll help our case." "The Lord will guide your path," Reverend Parker assured him, walking Paul to the door. But his voice dropped lower as they stepped onto the porch. "Watch yourself, Paul. Jed Cray's not a man to cross lightly. He'll fight dirty if he thinks he's losing his grip on what he considers his property." Paul's jaw tightened at the warning. "Ain't afraid of Cray or his kind. Done hiding in the mountains while men like him have their way." The return journey to his cabin seemed longer without Lily's quiet presence. The shepherd dog had stayed behind with her, a fact that gave Paul some comfort. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow, he urged the tired mule upward, his mind already mapping out tomorrow's search for evidence that might free Lily from Cray's clutches for good. The next morning dawned cold and clear. Paul Turner saddled his horse before first light, adjusting the cinch with stiff fingers. His breath clouded in the pre-dawn air as he led the animal down Silver Bluff's empty main street toward the parsonage. Martha Parker was already awake, a lamp burning in the kitchen window. She opened the door at his quiet knock, the warm scent of coffee and biscuits drifting out into the winter morning. "Lily's still sleeping," she whispered, gesturing toward the stairs. "Poor child was exhausted. The shepherd dog hasn't left her," sighed All Might. Paul nodded, grateful for Martha's motherly care. "I'm heading to Fort Garland," he said quietly. "Need to check some records at the Indian Agency office. Should be back by nightfall." "We'll keep her safe," Martha assured him, pressing a wrapped bundle of biscuits into his hands. "Go find what you need." The sun was just cresting the eastern mountains as Paul urged his horse southward. The fort lay a half-day's ride away, and he wanted to make good time before the weather turned. His mount's hooves crunched through the crusty snow as they followed the valley road dot by mid-morning. Paul reached the weather buildings of Fort Garland, The Indian Agency office occupied a small adobe structure near the parade ground. Inside, a thin clerk looked up from his desk, blinking at Paul through wire-rimmed spectacles. "Looking for land claim records," Paul explained, stamping snow from his boots. "Navajo family named Yazzie, filed maybe 8 or 9 years back." The clerk sighed but rose, shuffling toward a row of wooden filing cabinets. "Might take some time. Records ain't exactly organized proper." For the next several hours, Paul hunched over brittle papers and faded maps spread across a scarred wooden table. His fingers grew dusty as he carefully turned page after page. Finally, buried in a stack of grazing permits, he found what he sought: a claim filed by Thomas Yazzie for summer pasture land along Bear Creek. "Need copies of these," Paul said, laying out the relevant documents. The clerk grumbled but began transcribing, his pen scratching across fresh paper. Paul studied the original claim while he waited. The land Yazzie had registered lay squarely within what was now Jed Cray's northern range. The documentation wasn't complete. Several required stamps were missing, but it clearly showed Yazzie had filed his claim legally before Cray expanded his holdings. "This all we got on the Yazzie family?" Paul asked. The clerk shrugged. "Records show the father died of fever 2 winters back. No death certificate for the mother, but there's mention of a daughter." He squinted at Paul. "You representing the girl's interests?" "Something like that," Paul answered carefully, tucking the copied documents inside his coat. Outside, snow had begun falling in thick, lazy flakes. Paul mounted up quickly, knowing the weather would slow his return journey. The afternoon light was already failing as he pointed his horse northward through the gathering storm. The ride back seemed twice as long. Wind-driven snow stung Paul's face, and his mount had to pick its way carefully along the increasingly hidden trail. Darkness was settling over Silver Bluff by the time Paul finally reached the parsonage. His clothes crusted with ice. Martha Parker ushered him inside, clucking over his frozen state. "Get yourself by the fire," she insisted. "Lily's been watching out the window since sunset." The girl sat cross-legged on the parlor floor, the shepherd dog curled beside her. Her face brightened at Paul's entrance, though she remained shy and quiet. Paul shed his snow-covered coat and settled into a chair near the stove. Feeling warmth slowly returned to his bones. "Found something today," he told Lily, pulling out the copied documents. "These papers show your father filed claim on grazing land that rightfully belongs to you now." Lily listened intently as Paul explained, her dark eyes serious. She held her new Bible close, as if drawing strength from it. When he finished, she gave him a small, grateful smile that warmed him more than the stove's heat. "Thank you," she said softly in her halting English. "You helped me remember Father." Paul felt something shift in his chest, a fierce protectiveness replacing his usual detachment. He wasn't just sheltering her anymore. He had become her voice, her advocate in a world that would try to dismiss her claims. Looking at her hopeful face, he knew he would see this through, whatever the cost. The snow continued falling outside. The parsonage windows as Martha brought them bowls of hot stew. In the lamplight, Paul watched Lily feed bits of meat to the shepherd dog, and he knew his days of mountain solitude were truly over. Golden lamplight spilled from the church windows into the snowy evening as Paul, Lily, and the shepherd dog approached. The sound of voices and clinking dishes drifted through the cold air. Paul hesitated at the bottom of the wooden steps, his hand resting on Lily's thin shoulder. "You ready for this?" he asked quietly. Lily nodded, though she pressed closer to the dog at her side. The shepherd's tail wagged slowly, alert but calm. Inside, the church basement was warm and bright. Long tables covered in checkered cloths stretched end to end, laden with steaming dishes. The familiar scent of coffee and fresh bread filled the air. Conversations paused as Paul and Lily entered, curious eyes turning their way. Martha Parker hurried over, her face warm with welcome. "There you are. Lily, would you like to help serve the cornbread? We could use your careful hands." The girl's face brightened at being given a task. She followed Martha to a side table where other women were filling plates and bowls. Paul watched as Lily took up a basket of cornbread, offering pieces to each person with careful dignity. Her movements were precise, graceful beyond her years. "She's a good girl," Reverend Parker said, appearing at Paul's elbow. "Folks are starting to see it." Paul nodded, noticing how the initial stares had softened into smiles as Lily made her rounds. The shepherd dog padded quietly behind her, a gentle guardian drawing admiring glances of its own. The church door opened again, letting in a blast of cold air. Jed Cray stepped inside, removing his hat with exaggerated politeness. He didn't speak, just leaned against the back wall with a knowing smirk that made Paul's jaw tighten. But the cattleman made no move toward Lily, content for now to watch and wait. "Come get some supper," Martha called, breaking the tension. People began filling their plates, and the room hummed with conversation and laughter. Paul found himself drawn into discussions about winter grazing and spring prospects. It had been years since he'd shared a meal with neighbors, longer still since he'd felt the simple pleasure of community. Every so often, his eyes sought out Lily, making sure she was comfortable. She sat beside him now, her plate full of chicken and potatoes. The shepherd dog lay curled at her feet, accepting occasional scraps with gentle manners. Something warm and unfamiliar expanded in Paul's chest as he watched her. It felt strangely like family. "For our final hymn," Martha announced, moving to the upright piano, "let's sing Amazing Grace." Grace. The congregation rose. Hymnals opened. Paul remained seated, never much for singing, but he noticed Lily standing straight and tall beside him. As Martha's fingers touched the keys, the first notes rose clear and strong. Amazing grace, how sweet. The sound, one by one, voices joined in. Then Paul heard it, a small, clear thread of song beside him. Lily was singing, her voice fragile but pure, the English words careful on her tongue. She had learned this hymn in just days with Martha. Paul blinked hard, his vision suddenly blurred. How swiftly his solitary life had changed. 2 weeks ago, he had been alone in his cabin, content with silence. Now this child's song pierced straight to his heart, awakening feelings he'd thought long buried. The hymn ended, and people began gathering coats and saying goodbyes. Paul helped Lily into her borrowed shawl while the shepherd dog stretched and stood. "A fine evening," Reverend Parker said, walking them to the door. "You're welcome here any time, all three of you." Outside, the night had cleared. Stars glittered above the snow-covered peaks, and their breath frosted in the still air. Lily's small hand slipped into Paul's as they walked home. The shepherd dog trotted ahead, breaking trail through fresh snow. Paul gazed up at the bright stars, feeling a deep sense of rightness settle over him. The evening had passed without confrontation. The townspeople's acceptance felt like a turning point, a step toward true peace. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. This unlikely family born of mercy and need. Lily hummed softly beside him, fragments of the hymn floating on the night air. Her hand was warm in his, and Paul marveled at how such a small hand could anchor a man's drifting heart. 2 nights after the church supper, Paul sat in his cabin mending a harness by lamplight. Lily curled near the hearth, her borrowed Bible open on her lap as she sounded out words in a whisper. The shepherd dog dozed beside her, tail twitching in dreams. Outside, snow fell softly in the mountain darkness. The peace shattered with a roar of flames. Through the window, orange light suddenly blazed against the night sky. Paul leaped to his feet, knocking over his chair. "The barn!" he shouted, grabbing a wooden bucket. Lily filled the other bucket at the pump. They burst through the cabin, door into bitter cold. The barn was engulfed, flames shooting skyward as dry timber caught like kindling. Heat slapped their faces. The shepherd dog erupted in fierce barking. Hackles raised. Paul ran to the snow-crusted water pump, working the handle frantically. Lily appeared at his side with the second bucket, her face pale in the firelight. Together they hurled water at the cabin's nearest wall, trying to keep the flames from spreading. Again, Paul commanded, pumping more water. Lily's small hands gripped her bucket determinedly, though it was nearly too heavy for her to lift. The dog's barking grew more urgent, deeper, and threatening. Suddenly, dark figures emerged from the shadows. Before Paul could shout a warning, two men seized Lily from behind. She screamed, kicking wildly as they dragged her toward waiting horses. No. Paul threw his bucket aside and lunged toward her, but another attacker stepped into his path. Fist swinging, the shepherd dog launched itself at the men holding Lily, powerful jaws clamping onto one ranch hand's arm. The man howled in pain. His companion swung a rifle like a club, catching the dog hard across the skull with a sickening crack. The loyal animal crumpled into the bloody snow. "Paul, help me!" Lily's terrified cry pierced the night as the men threw her onto a horse. Paul fought desperately to reach her, taking a punch to the jaw that sent him staggering. By the time he regained his footing, the kidnappers were galloping away into the darkness, Lily's screams fading with them. "Lily!" His anguished shout echoed across the burning clearing. The barn's roof collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending a fountain of sparks into the sky. Paul grabbed more water, working frantically to save the cabin. Each splash of water felt like a betrayal. Every second spent fighting flames instead of pursuing Lily tore at his heart. Finally, the danger to the cabin passed. The barn was nothing but a smoldering ruin, black smoke rising into the snowy night. Paul stood panting, his clothes soaked and freezing, hands raw from the pump handle. A weak whine drew his attention. The shepherd dog had struggled to its feet, blood matting the fur around its muzzle. It limped to Paul's side, grabbing his sleeve between gentle teeth, pulling him toward the direction the riders had gone. "I know, boy," Paul said hoarsely. "We'll find her." The dog released his sleeve and took a few stumbling steps forward, looking back at Paul with desperate urgency in its eyes. Despite its injuries, the animal's loyalty never wavered. Rage and despair warred in Paul's chest as he quickly gathered supplies, his rifle, ammunition, rope, and blankets. He knew Jed Cray was behind this. The cattleman had waited for the perfect moment to strike, burning the barn to create chaos and confusion. "I swear by all that's holy," Paul muttered as he saddled his horse with shaking hands. "I won't rest until she's safe." The shepherd dog stood watching him, swaying slightly but determined. Blood dripped from its muzzle onto the pristine snow, each crimson drop a testament to its courage in trying to protect Lily. Paul mounted his horse, checking his rifle one last time. The dog limped forward, ready to follow despite its injuries. Looking down at the loyal animal, Paul felt his throat tighten. "Come on then," he said softly, reaching down to lift the wounded dog onto the saddle in front of him. "We'll find her together." The horse moved out at a steady walk, steam rising from its flanks in the cold air. Behind them, the ruins of the barn smoldered against the snow-filled night. Ahead lay only darkness and uncertainty, but Paul's jaw was set with grim determination. He had found family in that orphan girl and her brave dog. No matter what it took, he would bring Lily home. Long before sunrise, Paul stood in the frigid darkness of his cabin, gathering supplies. His fingers trembled, not from cold, but from a fury he hadn't felt in decades. He laid out clean bandages and a flask of whiskey, then knelt beside the shepherd dog. "This might hurt some, boy," he murmured, cleaning the dried blood from the animal's muzzle. The dog whimpered but held still, dark eyes fixed on Paul with absolute trust. Paul worked methodically, wrapping the dog's head with gentle hands. When he finished, he fashioned a makeshift sling from an old blanket, creating a way to carry the injured animal across his chest. Outside, his mule stomped impatiently in the Perdong gloom. Paul had chosen the sure-footed beast over his horse. In deep snow, the mule's wisdom would prove more valuable than speed. He secured his rifle, extra ammunition, rope, and provisions, then carefully lifted the dog into the sling. "Easy now," he whispered as the animal settled against him. The dog's nose twitched, already seeking Lily's scent on the wind. They set out as the eastern sky began to pale. Fresh snow had fallen after the kidnapping, but Paul could still make out signs of the raiders' passage. Broken branches, scattered clumps of disturbed snow, places where horses had pushed through deep drifts. The dog would growl softly whenever they crossed Lily's trail, confirming Paul's tracking. The mule plodded steadily through the wilderness, its breath forming clouds in the crystal air. As morning light filtered through the pines, Paul's mind wandered to memories of Lily. He heard again her quiet humming of Navajo songs while she helped with chores. Saw her shy smile as she accepted Mrs. Parker's Bible at the church supper. Remembered how she had begun to trust him, to feel safe. "Should have been watching closer," he muttered, guilt gnawing at his heart. The dog whined and pressed closer. As if sensing his pain by late morning, they had climbed into rocky hills thick with pine and scrub oak. Paul knew Jed Cray's ranch lay in the next valley. He had avoided the place for years, wanting no part of the cattleman's brutal reputation. Now, as he guided the mule along a narrow ridge, thin smoke appeared through the trees ahead. Paul dismounted carefully, mindful of the dog in its sling. He crept forward on foot until he could see down into the ranch yard. Two men with rifles patrolled between the main house and bunkhouse, their boots crunching in the snow. Another man chopped wood near the barn, an axe glinting in the winter sun. Through a window, Paul glimpsed Jed Cray himself, pacing inside the main house. The shepherd dog suddenly grew alert, nose pointing toward the bunkhouse. A low whine rose from its throat. Paul stroked its head, understanding. Lily must be held there, probably under guard. "I see it, boy," he whispered. "But there's too many of them for us alone." He studied the layout, noting every detail. The bunkhouse had 2 doors and 3 windows. A water pump stood nearby. The main house overlooked everything from a small rise. Any attempt to reach Lily would mean crossing open ground under multiple guns. The dog shifted restlessly in its sling, eager to charge down despite its injuries. Paul gentled it with a careful hand. "We'll get her back, lad," he promised softly. "One way or another. But we need help to do it right." As the short winter day faded toward dusk, Paul retreated from his observation post. The dog's dark eyes watched him trustingly as he led the mule back down the ridge, mind already working on plans. He would need all eyes, the Reverend Parker perhaps, or that young deputy who had seemed troubled by Cray's influence. Maybe both, somewhere. In that bunkhouse, Lily was waiting. Paul prayed she could hold on to courage for a little longer. He wouldn't risk her life with a rash assault, but neither would he abandon her to Cray's cruelty. The shepherd dog pressed close against his chest, their shared purpose clear. They would return, and next time, they wouldn't come alone. Paul urged his mule through the deepening night, the injured shepherd dog secure against his chest in its sling. Snow crystals stung his face as clouds parted to reveal a thin winter moon. The streets of Silver Bluff lay empty and dark when he finally reached town, save for a single lamp burning in the church parsonage window. His knuckles struck the wooden door hard enough to sting. "Reverend Parker," he called, voice hoarse from the cold ride. "It's Paul Turner. I need help." Footsteps shuffled inside, and the door creaked open to reveal Reverend Parker in his nightshirt, holding a lamp. Martha appeared behind him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "Land's sake, Paul," the Reverend said, ushering him inside. "What's happened?" In the warmth of their sitting room, Paul explained about tracking Lily to Cray's ranch. The shepherd dog lay at his feet, raising its bandaged head occasionally to whine softly. Martha knelt to comfort the animal, while her husband listened with growing concern. "We can't leave her there another night," Paul finished, his hands clenching. "But I can't get to her alone, not with Cray's men watching." Reverend Parker nodded. Gravely, "Wait here," he said, reaching for his coat. "I know who we can trust." While Martha brewed coffee, the Reverend disappeared into the night. He returned within the hour, bringing 4 men Paul recognized from town. First came Samuel Wade, the blacksmith, his leather apron still dusted with coal from his day's work. Behind him walked Miss Sarah Cooper, the schoolteacher, her face set with determination. Last came 2 ranch hands Paul had seen at the church supper, brothers named Tom and Jake Miller, who had worked Cray's spread until his cruelty drove them away. They gathered around the parsonage table while Martha poured coffee. The shepherd dog studied each newcomer carefully before settling back at Paul's feet with a low growl, as if declaring his continued readiness to fight despite his wounds. "Cray's gone too far this time," Samuel said, his massive hands curling around his coffee cup. "Taking a child by force. It ain't right," Miss Cooper nodded. "I've seen the bruises on other children he's claimed as wards. This has to stop." "We're with you," Tom Miller added, his brother Jake nodding beside him. "Men like that don't deserve to hold power over folks." Martha Parker stood near the fireplace, her Bible open in her hands. "Before we plan anything," she said firmly, "we should pray." Her clear voice filled the room. "Lord, grant us courage to stand for what's right. Show us the path to justice that doesn't require bloodshed. Protect young Lily and guide us in bringing her home safely." Paul shifted uncomfortably. At the prayer, his fingers itching for his rifle. But as Martha's words faded, he felt something settle in his spirit. Maybe she was right. Maybe there were better ways than violence to right this wrong. They spent the next hour planning carefully. The deed papers Paul had found would be their strongest weapon, proving Lily's rightful claim to her father's land. Miss Cooper offered to document Lily's treatment under Cray's care, while the Miller brothers could testify to his pattern of abuse. Samuel Wade knew the sheriff from Douglas County, an honest man who could be called if needed. "We ride at first light," Reverend Parker declared. A show of community strength might make Cray think twice before reaching for his guns. Paul wanted to argue for immediate action, but he looked down at the shepherd dog's trusting eyes and remembered how patience had won the animal's loyalty. Sometimes, he realized, the longest path was the surest one. As the others left to prepare for morning, Paul helped Martha lay blankets by the fire for him and the dog. Outside the eastern sky had begun to lighten, painting the snow-covered streets in shades of pearl and rose. He sat stroking the shepherd dog's head, steeling himself for what lay ahead. "Your heart's in the right place," Martha told him softly, bringing him one last cup of coffee. "But remember, true justice comes from standing together, not standing alone." Paul nodded, watching dawn approach through the parsonage window. In a few hours, they would ride for Cray's ranch, not as vigilantes in the night, but as a community demanding justice in the clear light of day. The dog pressed against his leg, and Paul felt the weight of the deed papers in his coat pocket. They were as powerful as any bullet, he realized, when backed by good people willing to stand for what was right. The winter sunrise painted the eastern Sky in bands of rose and amber as Paul Turner led the small group from Silver Bluff. Frost sparkled on every pine needle and fence post, while their horse's breath billowed like steam in the brittle morning air. The injured shepherd dog rode secure in a makeshift sling across Paul's saddle, its bright eyes scanning the trail ahead despite its bandaged wounds. Reverend Parker rode to Paul's right, his Bible tucked safely in his saddlebag. Behind them came Samuel Wade, his blacksmith's frame filling his saddle, followed by Miss Cooper and the Miller brothers. Their horses' hooves crunched through the crusty snow, marking their passage through the silent landscape. "Reckon we're about 2 miles out now," Tom Miller called softly from the rear. His brother Jake nodded in agreement, both men knowing the ranch's boundaries from their time working Cray's spread. Paul touched the deed papers in his coat pocket, feeling their weight like a shield against what lay ahead. The dog shifted in its sling, letting out a low whine as they crested a ridge and spotted smoke rising from Cray's ranch buildings in the valley below Dot by mid-morning. Their small band approached the main gate of Cray's ranch. 3 armed men lounged against the fence posts, their rifles close at hand. Their sneers faltered at the sight of Reverend Parker's collar, and the determined faces of respected townsfolk. Paul drew his horse to a halt, carefully lifting the dog from its sling before dismounting. His boots crunched in the snow as he stepped forward, voice carrying across the yard. "Tell Jed Cray to show himself. We've got business to settle." Movement stirred in the ranch house. The door swung wide, and Jed Cray emerged onto his porch. Thumbs hooked in his gun belt, his right hand rested meaningfully on his revolver as he surveyed the group with open contempt. "Well now," Cray drawled, descending the steps. "Quite a gathering for such an early hour. Come to beg forgiveness for harboring my runaway ward?" Paul withdrew the grazing deed from his coat, holding it high where all could see. "This here's proof that Lily Yazzie has rightful claim to her father's land you've taken without cause or conscience." Reverend Parker urged his horse forward, adding his voice to Paul's challenge. "The good book speaks plain about those who oppress the fatherless, Mr. Cray. What you've done to that child goes against both God's law and man's." Miss Cooper stepped down from her mount, producing a leather-bound notebook. "I've documented every bruise and injury you've inflicted on children placed in your care. The territorial judge will be mighty interested in these accounts." The Miller brothers dismounted as well, moving to flank Paul. "We've seen how you treat folks," Jake called out. "Worked your spread long enough to know your true nature." A crowd began gathering, ranch hands, cook staff, and stable boys drawn by the confrontation. They watched silently as Cray's face darkened with rage. Cray's laugh cut sharp as a knife through the morning air. "You think some moldy papers and church talk will stand against my word in these parts?" He spat into the snow. "I've built everything you see here. This is my land, my town, my territory. Now clear out before I have my men drive you off." Several ranch hands stepped forward, hands dropping to their weapons. The air grew thick with tension as both sides measured the distance to their guns. In that deadly quiet moment, the shepherd dog limped forward from behind Paul's legs. Though still wounded, it planted itself firmly beside its friend, raising its scarred head to loose a deep, warning growl. The sound carried across the yard, drawing murmurs from the watching crowd. The dog's defiance, born of loyalty rather than hate, seemed to strike a chord. More than one ranch hand shifted uncomfortably, gazes moving between the wounded animal standing its ground and their armed employer. The contrast between strength used to protect and strength used to dominate stood stark in the morning light. Paul kept his voice steady, though his hand wanted to stray to his own weapon. "We're not leaving without Lily. Either show us she's safe and release her proper, or we'll bring the law down on your head, and every soul who's witnessed your cruelty will stand ready to testify." The taut silence stretched across the snow-covered yard like a bowstring ready to snap. Then, from beyond the ranch gates, the sharp rhythm of approaching hoofbeats cut through the morning air. All heads turned as 3 riders appeared through the crystalline haze, their badges glinting in the winter sun. "You's Marshall!" The lead rider's voice carried clear and strong across the yard. Marshal James McCleary sat tall in his saddle, 2 deputies flanking him as they rode through the gate. Their presence sent a ripple through the gathered crowd, and more than one of Cray's men lowered their hands from their weapons. Mrs. Parker's telegram had found its mark. The marshal's timing couldn't have been better. Marshal McCleary dismounted. With practiced ease, his weathered face taking in the scene before him. His gaze swept from Paul and his allies to Cray, standing rigid on his porch, then to the wounded dog still growling softly at Paul's side. "Seems we've got ourselves quite a situation," the marshal said, adjusting his coat to keep his badge visible. "I received word of some irregularities regarding the custody of a Navajo child. Who's prepared to speak to that?" Paul stepped forward first, the deed papers steady in his hand. "Marshal, I'm Paul Turner. The girl's name is Lily Yazzie. She came to my cabin fleeing abuse." He offered the documents, which the marshal took with careful hands. "These show her father's legal claim to grazing rights on part of this land." Reverend Parker moved to stand beside Paul. "I can testify to the girl's condition when she first arrived in town, Marshal. She bore marks of mistreatment, and my wife has documented everything." Jed Cray's face flushed dark red as he stormed down from his porch. "This is absurd. That girl is my legal ward. Her parents died owing me money. Taking her in was an act of Christian charity." "Charity?" The marshal's voice cut like steel through Cray's bluster. He held up a hand, silencing the ranchers next. "Protest. Where's the girl now?" "In the bunkhouse," one of Cray's men volunteered, wilting under his employer's furious glare. "Bring her out," Marshal McCleary ordered. "Carefully." 2 ranch hands hurried to the bunkhouse. Moments later, they emerged with Lily between them. She clutched Mrs. Parker's Bible to her chest, her small frame trembling but her chin held high. The sight of her brought a curse from one of the deputies, who quickly crossed himself. The marshal's expression hardened as he took in Lily's condition, her thin clothes, the fading bruises on her wrists, the fear in her eyes. "Come here, child," he said, his gruff voice gentling. Lily darted forward, but not to the marshal. She ran straight to Paul, pressing her face into his coat as his arms wrapped protectively around her. The shepherd dog, despite its injuries, pressed against their legs, its tail offering a weak wag of joy at their reunion. "Well now," Marshal McCleary said, watching the scene. "That speaks clear enough." He turned to Cray, who had begun to sputter new protests. "Mr. Cray, let me be plain. The practice of holding children as property against debts, real or imagined, is unlawful in this territory. These papers show clear title to land you've claimed without right. Your actions regarding this child border on criminal." "You can't." Cray started, his hand twitching toward his gun. "I can, and I will," the marshal cut in. "You've got 2 choices. Accept this ruling and stay clear of the girl and her guardian, or face charges that'll land you in territorial prison. Which will it be?" Cray's face twisted with rage, but even he couldn't miss how his men had stepped back, leaving him isolated. The fight drained from his shoulders, replaced by bitter defeat. "Deputies," Marshal McCleary called. "Escort Mr. Cray back into his house. He'll stay there under watch until we've cleared the property." He turned to Paul, his stern features softening slightly. "Mr. Turner, you and the girl are free to go. I'll need statements from all witnesses, but that can wait until tomorrow." Relief flooded through Paul's body as he held Lily close. She was trembling less now, her small hands gripping his coat as though she'd never let go. The shepherd dog leaned harder against them both, offering what comfort it could despite its wounds. Around them, the tension began to dissolve like morning frost in sunshine. The Miller brothers smiled openly now, while Miss Cooper dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Reverend Parker bowed his head in a quiet prayer of thanksgiving. Two deputies guided a glowering Cray back toward his house, their hands never far from their weapons. The rancher's final glare promised this wasn't truly over, but for now, at least, justice had prevailed. The marshal swung back into his saddle, tipping his hat to Paul. "Get her somewhere warm," he advised. "We'll sort out the rest tomorrow." Morning sunlight painted Silver Bluff's main street in shades of gold and amber. Townsfolk gathered outside the whitewashed church, their breath visible in the crisp winter. There, Paul stood on the church steps beside Reverend Parker, feeling strangely formal in his cleanest shirt. Lily waited next to him in a dress Mrs. Parker had altered, her dark hair neatly braided. The shepherd dog sat at attention between them, its wounds wrapped in fresh bandages. "Friends and neighbors," Reverend Parker's voice carried across the crowd. "We gathered today to right a wrong and welcome new members to our community." He held up the official papers, their edges crisp in the morning light. These documents confirm Lily Yazzie rightful claim to her father's land. More importantly, they establish Paul Turner as her legal guardian until she comes of age. A murmur rippled through the assembled townspeople. Paul noticed several nods of approval, even from those who'd been skeptical days before. The blacksmith, Tom Miller, crossed his arms and smiled broadly, while Miss Cooper, the schoolteacher, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "The U.S. Marshal has reviewed and approved these arrangements," the preacher continued. "Under territorial law and God's grace, they are now family in every way that matters." A cheer rose from the crowd, starting with Mrs. Parker and spreading. Quickly, Paul felt Lily's small hand slip into his, and he squeezed it gently. The dog's tail wagged, thumping against the wooden steps as though adding its own approval. Even the gruff stable master, who'd long viewed Paul with suspicion, stepped forward to offer a rough handshake. "You done right by the girl," he said gruffly. "Reckon that makes you good people in my book." The gathering gradually moved inside the church, where Mrs. Parker had arranged a modest celebration. Coffee steamed in tin cups while plates of cornbread and preserved fruit made rounds through the crowd. Lily stayed close to Paul's side, but her shy smiles grew more frequent as townspeople welcomed her with kind words and small gifts. A hair ribbon from Miss Cooper, a carved wooden horse from Miller's youngest son Dot. As afternoon shadows lengthened, the crowd thinned until only the closest supporters remained. Mrs. Parker invited them to stay for supper at the parsonage, her eyes twinkling as she mentioned having made Lily's favorite cornbread. The parsonage dining room glowed with lamplight as they shared the simple meal. Lily helped Mrs. Parker serve, her movements careful and deliberate. The dog dozed contentedly beneath the table, occasionally accepting scraps from Lily's gentle hand. After the dishes were cleared, Mrs. Parker sat at the small pump organ in the corner. "Lily," she called softly, "would you like to learn a hymn?" The girl nodded eagerly, settling beside the preacher's wife on the wooden bench. The first notes of "Amazing Grace" filled the room as Mrs. Parker guided Lily through the melody. Paul listened, surprised by how quickly the child caught on to the tune. When Mrs. Parker encouraged everyone to join in, Paul hesitated, unsure of his rough voice. "Come now, Brother Turner," Reverend Parker urged kindly. "The good Lord welcomes all voices." Paul cleared his throat and added his deep bass to the chorus. He might have missed a few notes, but the joy in Lily's face when she heard him sing made any embarrassment worthwhile. The dog lifted its head and offered a soft howl, drawing laughter from everyone. Later, as Lily dozed in a rocking chair, Paul stepped onto the back porch with Reverend Parker. The night air carried the sharp bite of approaching snow. "Preacher," Paul said quietly. I've been having doubts. Not about keeping Lily, he added quickly, but about my fitness for the task. I'm an old mountain man, set in my ways. What do I know about raising a child? Reverend Parker was silent for a moment, considering. Paul, family isn't just about blood or even know-how. It's about choice and commitment. Look how far you've already come, from a solitary man to one who'd face down an entire ranch for a child's sake. But at my age, Paul started. Moses was no young man when God called him to lead. The preacher reminded him. The Lord equips those who step forward in faith. You've already shown more wisdom than many younger men, recognizing that protecting Lily was right despite the cost. Paul absorbed these words, watching his breath mist in the cold air. Reckon I'll need that faith, he admitted. And some help. Along the way. You'll have both, Reverend Parker assured him. From above and from this community. When Paul and Lily returned to the cabin that night, the dog limping proudly beside them, his heart felt lighter. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but they would walk it together. Lily's quiet humming of the new hymn drifted through the darkness, a reminder that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as challenges. The mountain air carried hints of spring as Paul and Lily worked side by side, rebuilding their barn from the ashes. Neighbors had rallied around them, bringing lumber and willing hands. The rhythmic sound of hammers filled the clearing as Tom Miller, the blacksmith, showed Lily how to hold nails steady. Like this? She asked, her small fingers carefully positioning. A nail. Just so, Tom nodded, while Paul smiled from where he secured roof beams. The shepherd dog lounged in patches of melting snow, its wounds healed to proud scars. Though still protective, it had grown playful, often bounding after squirrels with renewed energy. Its barks echoed through the trees, bringing laughter to Lily's face. Paul taught her the ways of mountain life, showing her how to split kindling and tend the vegetable patch they'd started. She proved a quick study, especially with animals. The old mule that had once shied from everyone now followed her gentle commands without hesitation. One quiet afternoon, as Paul mended harness leather by the fire, Lily approached with something hidden behind her back. She shifted from foot to foot, suddenly shy. What you got there, little one? Paul asked softly. She brought forth a wooden cross, carefully whittled from pine, its edges smooth from hours of patient work. It's for our home, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Paul's throat tightened as he took the gift, running weathered fingers over its simple lines. Without a word, he lifted Lily onto his shoulders so she could help hang it above the hearth. The dog watched from its place by the fire, tail thumping against the floorboards. Each Sunday morning found them in the church pews, Lily's dark hair neatly braided by Mrs. Parker's skilled hands. Her voice rang clear during hymns, while Paul's deeper tones rumbled beside her. The same townsfolk who had once viewed the mountain man with suspicion now greeted him warmly, including him and Lily in community gatherings and shared meals. Though peace had settled over their days, Paul remained vigilant. His rifle stayed loaded, and he taught Lily safe places to hide if trouble came. But weeks passed without sight of crazed men, and gradually, his shoulders began to lose their tension. Laughter, once a stranger to Paul's cabin, now filled its walls. It bubbled up when the dog chased its tail, when Lily told stories from school, when they shared simple suppers by lamplight. Life grew richer with each passing day, as their unlikely family put down roots in the mountain soil. The bond between them strengthened like young saplings reaching towards sunlight. Paul, the gruff mountain man, Lily, the resilient child, and their faithful dog, each healing the other's wounds through love and presence. The spring evening painted the Colorado mountains in soft gold and purple. Paul and Lily sat on a rough-hewn bench outside their cabin, watching the sun sink toward the western peaks. The air carried the sweet scent of pine and new grass, while chimney smoke curled lazily above their heads. The rebuilt barn stood proud against the darkening sky, its fresh timber and sturdy walls a testament to community and perseverance. Inside, Paul's mule shuffled in clean straw, content after a day's work. The shepherd dog sprawled at their feet, his scarred hide gleaming in the fading light. Lily held her treasured Bible in small hands, the one Mrs. Parker had given her months ago. Her finger traced each line carefully as she read aloud from the book of Ruth. Paul listened, his heart swelling with pride at how far she'd come with her reading. And Ruth said, "Lily, work through the words, and treat me not to leave." That's right," Paul encouraged softly. "Keep going." She continued, stumbling occasionally but pressing forward with determination. The same determination, Paul realized, that had carried her through so much hardship. The dog's tail thumped against the earth in slow rhythm with her words. When the light grew too dim to read, Lily closed the Bible reverently. The silence wrapped around them like a warm blanket, broken only by evening birds and the distant cry of a coyote. She leaned against Paul's side, her small frame fitting perfectly under his arm. "We're safe now, Papa," she whispered. The word caught Paul off guard. Papa. It struck his heart like summer lightning, spreading warmth through his entire being. He had never expected to hear that word again, not since losing his own child so many years ago. Now it filled an empty space he had carried for decades. Paul tightened his arm around Lily's shoulders, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The dog lifted its head, ears pricking at their stillness, then settled back down with a contented sigh. Looking out across the valley, Paul marveled at how life had changed. His cabin, once a shelter for his loneliness, now buzzed with warmth and purpose. Where silence had ruled, now Lily's songs and laughter echoed. The cross she had carved hung above their hearth, a symbol of the faith that had brought them together. He had never sought this second chance at family. Yet here it was, given to him through a wounded dog and a brave little girl. God's mercy, he reckoned, worked in mysterious ways. The first stars began to twinkle above the mountains as Paul held his daughter close, thankful for the gift of beginning. Again, if this story made you pause, reflect, or even smile, don't forget to subscribe. I post daily, and the next story might be exactly what you need to hear.